Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll be getting started as soon as I see critical mass has been achieved with our participants. We're waiting on people to join us. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Kaur. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society. This is session number 5 in our webinar series, Tennessee 101, Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era. And hopefully I can move forward here. If you want to sign up for our next 6 sessions, you will need to go to our website, tennesseehistory.org/home/programs. We do not have the next 6 sessions up yet. We're still finalizing those details, but don't worry. Those start in the middle of January of 2022. And if you've signed up for this particular webinar, you will be getting an email once these programs are live on our website. So you'll get plenty of announcements about signing up for those. So starting the middle of January through the end of February, 6 more sessions on the Progressive Era. Now, when you go to the page for tonight's event, you'll see off to the side where it says resources. This is a link to the first volume of Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era that Dr. Mary Evans edited. And you'll also see a link to the Padlet. And this is our fancy term for cloud storage. And this is what it looks like. And I can tell you that we have been adding to it, so it looks more full than this. Our speakers have put their slides on here. They might have put a blog post or a link to an article or more images. So if you just can't get enough, please go there. Off to the left in that column, you'll see another link to the book that Dr. Evans edited, and then a link to the 2 special issues that the Tennessee Historical Quarterly produced on woman suffrage. If you missed one of the previous 4 sessions, you can go to the page for that particular session, and down at the bottom, you'll see down here, there's a little YouTube link and you can watch the recording. And that reminds me, if you want to turn on your transcription, you can do that. Go to your menu bar and under more, it will say, let's see, live transcript, and you can turn on the auto transcript and get a subheadings. We'd like to invite you to follow us on social media. Our Facebook is 10 History. Our Instagram is at Tennessee Historical Society, and our Twitter is at TEN History. And Nikki's going to drop those links in the chat for you throughout the evening so that you can find your way to those social media channels. We'd like to thank Humanities Tennessee, our major sponsor for this series. Without them, this would not be possible. So thanks to Humanities Tennessee for funding this. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Mary Evans, who will introduce our speakers. Dr. Evans is the co-convener, along with Dr. Manoa Uffelman of our Tennessee Progressive Women in the Progressive Era. And she's the editor of the first volume and co-editor along with Dr. Uffelman of the second volume, which is coming out in 2022. So Dr. Evans, feel free to introduce our speakers.
I'm happy to. Thank you, Jennifer, and our thanks to the Tennessee Historical Society for this wonderful series. We're so thrilled about it. I'm going to introduce to you for this evening our 2 speakers. Dr. Crystal deGregory, who is a research fellow at the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation, who will be speaking on African-American college women, and Dr. Mary Ellen Pethel, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies and Global Education at Belmont University. Dr. Pethel will be talking about Lady Other, gendered communities and college sports. So I'm going to turn it directly over to Dr. Pethel, and thank you.
All right, thank you so much for having me. And so I don't want to share it with you, I just want to present. There we go. All right, thank you again for coming, and thank you so much to Humanities Tennessee, to the Tennessee Historical Society, Dr. Mary Evans, Dr. Manoa Uffelman, Dr. Crystal deGregory. I'm honored to be presenting with her. And so I'm going to jump right in. This discussion is Lady Other versus Miss Ideal. And I'll explain that title because it's kind of odd. I'll explain that title in just a second. So gendered communities and college sports. This talk is specifically looking at white women's all-female institutions here in Nashville. And so that's what we'll be focusing on. And then I'm so thrilled that Dr. deGregory will be talking about African-American higher education as well. So I'm splitting this into 4 different categories here to just sort of walk us through this, journey with all-female institutions after the Civil War. So I'm going to talk briefly about schools, touch on curriculum, then look at leisure, and then culminate with sports as a thread that runs throughout the 1865, really through the 1930 period. So I want to start you off with just a quick overview of the schools. We are going to have here in Nashville, excuse me, 9 schools that are going to come into existence from 1864 to 1912. Actually 10 if you count Ward Belmont. Ward Belmont was the merger of the 2 main schools I'll be talking about, Ward Seminary and Belmont College for Young Women. Those are going to merge in 1913. And this is part of how Nashville gets his reputation as Athens of the South. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least throw up a quick plug of a book that I published in 2017 called Athens of the New South, looking at this exact period, but not just looking at women, looking at all of the schools from Vanderbilt to Fisk and Meharry. All the schools that you see on this list are represented in the book. But tonight I'll be focusing on the women's schools themselves. And I also want to just give a quick plug that Dr. deGregory is actually cited and quoted in the book. So congratulations there. So let me get to this title, Lady Other and Miss Ideal. And I'm going to read to you a quote. So in 1903, the Iris, which was the annual of Ward Seminary for Ladies, which was located in downtown Nashville and established in 1865. It revealed an intriguing dichotomy in an editorial called The Ideal and the Other. Agnes Amos was the treasurer of the senior class, and she started off with, "My ideal, like the other, is preparing for college, but oh, the difference between them." Her submission documents the shifting self-perception of many women attending institutions of higher education in the progressive era. And Amos describes 2 very different models of femininity, but in truth, most educated Southern women emerge as a hybrid between the 2, a modern belle of sorts, a modern belle that also embraced physical activity and sports. So here's the quote. "Miss Ideal is quite a studious girl who is very fond of her books, stands high in her classes. She takes any caller she happens to have out and plays tennis or ball or runs races with him. She is very proud of her prowess in athletic sports, and in fact is fond of telling how she distanced her beau in a foot race. She spends much time on books and likes nothing better than to dream of herself in cap and gown as part of the landscape." Then in contrast, Amos describes Lady Other with undertones of reverence as the traditional Southern woman. She is not, here's the quote, "She is not entirely different, for she is a graceful feminine creature. She cares much for style. Not Miss Ideal's sort of style, however. The delights of her heart are dancing balls, beaux, true love, and to be a real young lady. She is the same in school as she is out. She is seemingly very frivolous and light, but beneath that runs a strong current of the good and the noble. Taken all in all, they are very different, yet quite attractive in their ways. They form a striking contrast." So I wanted to use this to sort of juxtapose this shifting identity that you see of a lot of white upper class women in institutions of higher education in the late 1890s and through the end of the progressive era, even through the 1920s and through the 1930s. So some of this begins with curriculum, and it was what I have termed a gentrification, if you will, of curriculum, where there's specific curriculum that is created specifically for the gender of women. So rather than taking hard sciences like physics, for example, or biology, they would shift over and look at science in the home, or domestic science, or home economics. They weren't preaching to go to med school, but it was okay to be a nurse. And of course, we know that teachers are largely shifting to women as the professionals in that sector as well. So you do see this curriculum shift, and this is a picture here of Ward Belmont in 1915 of their domestic science laboratory. And these new curricular options do provide new opportunities for women in the professional ranks. And higher education was a vehicle that provided these new lanes of opportunity and of agency. So in many ways, higher education served as a springboard. And Nashville, like other local Southern communities, maintained and reinforced Southern notions of not the modern woman, but the modern belle. Here's a picture from an 1895 Belmont College for Young Women yearbook that just juxtaposes these two images. She took domestic science at Belmont. He took football at Vanderbilt. And that brings us then to leisure. Institutions such as Ward Belmont were determined not to let the sexual revolution of the 1920s upset the notions of proper behavior and dress and decorum needed to become a, quote, Southern lady. However, girls, especially at Ward Belmont after 1913, when the two schools merged, they were allowed to bob their hair and cut it short, which had previously been illegal. They made it legal to cut and bob your hair in 1923. There was not a formal dress code, but students were expected to dress plainly, and makeup was only allowed for off-campus excursions and for dinner. When going out in groups for non-school activities, girls were required to wear long, dark dresses, gloves, and matching dark hats. So men at Vanderbilt joined fraternities that included rushing and hazing and drinking, and women at Nashville's all-white and all-girls schools still held tea parties, wore white gloves, and generally followed rules of formal courtship. That said, leisure is changing quite a bit, and it's certainly going to allow for more social interaction between men and women. I'm going to show you two pictures that illustrate this shift. So here's a picture in 1890 of what they called a manless dance at Belmont College for Young Women. And if any of you have ever been to the Belmont Mansion, this is the Grand Salon there in the Belmont Mansion. From 1890 to 1920, students at Ward Seminary, Belmont College for Young Women, and then later Ward Belmont were still required to have an adult or faculty chaperone whenever they left campus. And on-campus events were still female only, at least through World War I. So yep, dances had to get a little bit more creative because they were not allowed to invite men to campus. But by the 1930s, things had changed, and it allowed for more heterosocial interaction, more casual interaction between men and women. An image representing Vanderbilt's annual Mammoth Cave Ball circa 1930. Here you see an example of men and women having a grand old time at Vanderbilt's sponsored event called the Mammoth Cave Ball. And you don't see any chaperones in this picture, right? Nor do you see long white gloves, long dresses, or matching hats. And they are drinking, but I somehow imagine that they're not drinking tea. That said, Ward Belmont still controlled dating to a large extent. They required chaperones and written parent permission until 1935. So alumna Sarah Colley Cannon, who you might know better as Minnie Pearl, graduated, actually, she was here in 1930, 31, 32, graduated in 32. She wrote in a retrospective piece, actually published in the Tennessee Historical Review. She wrote in 1971 a great quote about her college years that helps describe this kind of this picture. She said, quote, "One wonders if all this procedure was worth a 2-hour visit in a Victorian parlor equipped with full-length mirrors at strategic points, hard horsehair sofas, and a gliding chaperone who somehow floated through the rooms continually, making her presence known by clearing her throat. That's the process they went to when they had a young man come to campus to take them on a date. So then that brings us to sports. So men's sports had previously been forbidden to women by the dictates of decency, but the growing popularity of competitive college sports for men in many ways emancipated young white women. They participated first as watchers or supporters at men's sporting events, which in and of themselves became new and exciting sites of interaction between college men and women. But significant numbers of women also participated directly in the collegiate sports movement, creating their own niche as athletes themselves. And this evolved after the Civil War and followed Victorian era trends that had already begun to emphasize the development of good health. And under the umbrella of education, these women were able to engage in physical activity and competitive sports in a way that was still culturally acceptable. In this picture, you see two photos from Belmont College for young women. You can tell this is still in the late 1890s, early 1900s, because of the dress, the long dresses, still, you know, the laced up boots. And these are for recreation. These are not competitive intercollegiate matches between schools, but rather more like club sports or intramural sports. An alumna named Deborah Rose Baird, who attended Ward Seminary from 1901 to 1906, actually wrote in the 1935 Ward Belmont Alumna Journal a retrospective piece detailing a day in 1905, May 1905. And so I just did a screenshot of just a little short clip here to help you understand what women are going through as they begin to want to participate more in sports, and how their clothing both is a hindrance, but then is something that they are able, that sports allows them to be able to literally lighten their load, to be able to change the way that they're dressing. So some of these changes in clothing, as noted here, corsets and multiple layers, they were not advantageous for the active lifestyle. New innovations like elastic and new trends like bicycling allowed women to remove many of their layers, and it's hard to ride a bicycle in a long skirt, of course, right? So in 1901, an article entitled "The American Girl of Today" actually stated, quote, "It's interesting to note that 47% of the girls entering schools wear corsets, but they are given up in consequence of advice and the teaching of their physical education instructors." Her quote here that you see is I love it, as she's talking about this event in 1905, and she says pill swatting, what it is, kind of an unofficial baseball game. But they're also playing tennis, they're having field days and recreation days. And she's looking back and she says, though how we played anything more athletic than checkers in those numerous tight, stiff garments in which we encased ourselves becomes an increasing marvel to me as time goes on. Here's another example of the dress still being very restrictive. And then in later photos, you'll see sort of the liberation of clothing for women. And this also brings us to one of the signature events here in Nashville and historic events for women's sports. Basketball, of course, was the leading sport for women, and it was one that pushed boundaries of femininity because it required a lot of practice, physicality, it required natural ability. The first game women's game was held in 1893. The game was invented in 1891. So Ward Seminary formed a team in the mid-1890s, as did Vanderbilt University. And in March of 1897, wearing the bloomers you see, the tie-down boots, the cumbersome blouses, Ward Seminary squared off against Vanderbilt University in the first women's basketball game recorded publicly in Tennessee. The game was played in Vanderbilt's old university gymnasium, which had been built in 1880. There was a catch, though. This first game, though it allowed spectators, it did not allow male spectators. The officials and the administration felt that it just put a little bit too much in co-education. But a member of the Hustler, Vanderbilt's newspaper, snuck into the game, watched the game, and wrote about it afterwards in a fairly famous article published in the hustler. And I'm just going to read a couple of his quotes. He said, in spite of the precautions and vigilance of don't let a man come in, I gained admission and hid myself in a corner to await developments. The agility of some of them was really surprising as they got around after the ball in a manner that would put some of our GEM graduates to shame. The teams seemed pretty evenly matched, and Vandy co-eds ended up having an advantage in the matter of weight. I'll let you read into it what he might be referring to there. They're playing against Vanderbilt University. You see the final score 0-5. That sounds like an odd basketball score, and it would be low by any measure, but baskets at that time were worth 5 points. And so the score of the game was Ward Seminary 0, Vanderbilt 1 basket to score 5 points. And that was held in March of 1897. So he made a sort of unflattering reference to the Vanderbilt players' weight, but I don't see anything wrong with them. Here's the team not in 1897, but shortly after in 1908. Many of the same women were actually still playing, and that was something that was different. You could play as a student, but you could also play as an alum. You could play as a faculty member. And that's where I just want to deviate for 1 minute to mention Stella Vaughn. She's mostly at Vanderbilt, and that's not an all-female institution, but she was a graduate of Ward Seminary, and she moved to Nashville with her family. Her father, Dr. William Vaughn, was a professor of mathematics and astronomy. They moved into a house on the Vanderbilt campus. She attended Ward Seminary, and then in 1892 was one of 10 women admitted as a special student at Vanderbilt University. She's the woman who's on the far left of your screen in that picture. She graduated in 1897. As a first-year graduate, stayed on, played in that first game against Ward Seminary. She didn't score the basket, but she is credited with the assist that scored the basket. And she went on to coach and play for another like 15 years. She also became unofficially the Dean of Women, even though she wasn't paid until 1905. She ended up staying at Vanderbilt, started Kappa Alpha Theta, lived in the Vaughn home and other places on campus that house female students, and ended up working at Vanderbilt until the 1950s and passed away in 1960. She was known as the Grand Old Lady of Vanderbilt and probably one of the biggest advocates for women's sports in Nashville. One of the reasons she wasn't made the first Dean of Women at Vanderbilt is because she was her advocacy for wanting competitive women's sports was just a little too progressive for Chancellor Kirkland, and he didn't want to go in that direction. So he went with someone else who saw that women should just keep it to an intramural competition. One last piece of trivia, if you're thinking about, I referenced the Vaughn home. If any of you know where the Robert Penn Warren Center is on the Vanderbilt campus, that is the home where Stella Vaughn and her family lived. So you see that the dress is changing quite a bit here, and this is the same picture that you saw on my title slide. This is in the early 1900s on the Ward Belmont campus. They've all traded in. They're wearing the bloomers, the sailor shirts. If you look over here to the right, that's the basketball goal right over here, right above those two women on the right side of your screen. And you can see them holding the banner there for Ward Belmont right back here. So it's not just, excuse me, it's not just basketball. It's also tennis. There are also still field days. There are also, in some cases, track. But it's an overall physical culture that's taking place in these women's schools. And it's really, you're going to see, now this picture is more 1930, era 1930, but I'm going back, it's really just going to start after 1900. And it's the idea that women's well-being and physical well-being is important. And so, for example, Ward Seminary announced in 1911 that physical culture is a special feature of seminary life. The gymnasium and bowling alleys afford abundant exercise. Excuse me, lessons in swimming are offered throughout the year, as are tennis, basketball, croquet, field hockey, and other outdoor sports. So this was really part of the body as a temple, and it was part of the curriculum. Every student was required to take a physical culture or physical education. Sort of the matriarch of PE and of sports at Ward Seminary and later Ward Belmont was Catherine Morrison. She's going to come to Ward Seminary first in 1911. Then after the merger, she serves as the athletic director from 1932 to 1951. In addition to sports, she also is in charge of all the May Day festivities, sponsored a lot of clubs, spent over 60 years at the institution, and didn't work until she was 104, but passed away at the age of 104. The gymnasium at Harpeth Hall School is still called the Catherine Morrison Gymnasium. Harpeth Hall is the former high school of Ward Belmont. And so you can see here, Catherine Morrison, really part of that old guard. You can see her training was not in sports, but rather in dancing and calisthenics. So she was definitely sort of had the school marm image, and was famous for using her whistle. So what you start to see by 1920 and into the 1920s is still a lot of competition, but it's not tracking with men's competition. Men's sports. Men's sports are growing into really an industry, a business in and of themselves, and women are not tracking the same way. It's going to shift it's going to shift a lot more towards school spirit and also camaraderie and loyalty and unity. So an example of this is a poem from 1920 from Rosalind Kirst, and I'll let you read the poem for yourself, but what she's talking about here is not competing with other schools and sort of an adrenaline pumping competition where they're playing for high stakes, but this is more like club competition. At Ward Belmont, they had 10 clubs. Everyone was assigned to a club. And for each of these sports, they were playing for a club cup. So what happens to competitive women's sports? What happens is that there are a lot of shifts that began in 1925 into 1930 and then after. And so there's a backlash, but I just wanted to touch briefly on all of the shifts that we see in the categories that I've talked about. So from the schools, you're going to see that we're going to go more co-eds, and single gender begins to decline. By 1930, this is not helped by the Great Depression, but schools like Ward Belmont began declining in the 1930s with a lack of enrollment because of the Great Depression. They never quite recover. And as schools like Vanderbilt and others began to accept more co-eds, then many women's schools either merge or they go out of business, and that's what happens with Ward Belmont, which is purchased by the Tennessee Baptist in 1951. With curriculum, you see soft sciences in normal schools and fine arts. There's less limitation, but there's still not the norm going into more male-dominated professions. As far as leisure, you go from women only really socializing with women unless they have a lot of permission and the school has signed off and their parents have signed off, to much more casual interaction with men and women at events like male sporting events and also dances and things like that. And then finally for sports, you go from like this calisthenic kind of workout physical education class to extramural play like you see with Vanderbilt and Ward Seminary, and then it's going to revert back to an intramural or club system, as I mentioned, in the 1920s and 30s. So where does this backlash come from? Well, in 1925, the Women's Division of National Amateur Athletic Federation, they actually passed a resolution that bars extramural competition between schools, publicly played games that require a purchased admission. And a lot of this is a backlash really to the overall progressive era. They have fears of immorality of sports, especially what they're seeing in men's sports with gambling and violence and cheating. It's a desire to check the progressive era's new woman in the public sphere in some ways. And some states actually make women's sports illegal. Colorado and Alabama, both among a few others, codify it into state law. And so the shift from sports to sports sake mindset is going to come in by 1930. And all of these women's schools, but just really generally women's sports, are going to go to the intramural club system, where they will be limited to clubs, field days, and physical education classes for the next 45 years. And as I wrap up here on the last slide, this is a topic that I hold near and dear to my heart, not only as someone who is a high school and college athlete, but also someone who benefited from when intramurals finally did enter the modern age of women's sports with the passage of Title IX. I'm someone who benefited from Title IX as sort of the second generation, a daughter of Title IX, if you will, that came through in the 1980s and 1990s. And so I'd like to just quickly plug something that will be out about a year from now, or about, let's see, probably more like 9 months from now, is that I'm working on the next phase. So we've talked tonight about the early phase of women's sports, but in a forthcoming book that I am publishing with the University of Tennessee Press that should be out in September of next year, I'm going to be looking at Title IX at 50, where I'll be doing chapter profiles of 50 individuals here in Tennessee who were a big part in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with the advancement of the modern women's sports era. And so I'd like to thank you, and I would like to pass the baton to Dr. Crystal deGregory, who will be talking to us about African-American women's schools and higher education, not schools, but higher education, and tell us the other half of the story. So with that, take it away, Crystal.
Thanks so much, Doc. Good evening, and thank you all for being here with us. I guess if we could get the screen to stop sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's fine. I don't want to overpromise, right? I don't, trying to underpromise, overdeliver here.
I can leave Title IX up, but you take it.
It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Wow, as a certifiable high school women's athlete and a should have been college women's athlete, I can tell you that was quite a presentation. If only the African American women only had to worry about being women, my presentation this evening might be quite a bit different. I have been out for the count with a case of food poisoning. And so I don't want to overpromise with slides. I do promise to tell you quite a few stories that I hope will entertain as well as informed. African-American college women, wow, that's really broad. I should have said in Nashville, and really, mostly I should have said in the really early period, which of course would lead to an over-reliance on Fisk as Nashville's oldest continuing institution of higher education. But I do have a surprise with Fisk. So first, an explanation of the positioning of this kind of biographical examination, if you will. Progressive era leadership in the United States has for more than a century been thought of as the purview of whites in general and of white men in particular. Then and now, whites are far more likely to enjoy the benefits of the era's salutary social and political reforms. Conversely, the unremitting relegation of Black Americans to, at best, second-class citizenship meant that Blacks were slow to receive the benefits of any labor, including that of their own. Black Americans were neither oblivious or passive about this reality when they nonetheless endeavored to improve themselves and their communities. In doing so, they improved the fate of the race and forced the nation closer to its repeatedly espoused yet unrealized ideals. Not diminished citizenship status or the popularization of scientific racism, not even the persistent reign of white terror and lynchings could stamp out the determination of Black Americans to fashion and force the creation of an American nation where they too enjoyed its founding promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the decades that ensued from the progressive period, the commitment and arguably ability of historians to recognize how or even that Blacks accomplished this feat was limited to top-down approaches to what and to whose stories mattered. In his 1999 essay for OH Magazine of History, Jimmy Franklin, who was a professor at Vanderbilt, where I earned my master's and PhD, and for a long time, the sole Black faculty member in the Department of History at Vanderbilt, argued that an expansion of professional approaches to the subject began in the 1970s to seriously consider that Black progressivism, often paraded as Black self-reliance. Quote, in the broad sense, wrote Franklin, they, Black progressives, view progressivism as the effective use of collective organization, energy, and resources directed towards a community's growth, advancement, or uplift, end quote. Often impeded but never destroyed by white supremacy, the aspirations of Black reformers were not unlike their white counterparts, achieving a greater sense of community and order, preserving moral values, and perfecting social institutions were all among Black progressives' desired outcomes. Just how they would achieve these ambitious ends, despite the back-breaking and soul-crushing persistence of white supremacy, however, was most often contentious, and even when agreed upon, remained dubious and elusive. This debate was at the heart of what would become a long-running intraracial tension, as well as the resulting narrowly construed definitions of what it meant to be a Black, quote, conservative versus a Black, quote, radical, typified by the now age-old sparring between the, quote, conservative founder of the Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, Booker T. Washington, and the, quote, radical Fisk University graduate, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard University. Characterizations of Black leadership during the progressive era rarely allowed prominent personalities to exist outside of this binary. An expansive view of Black progressivism, however, contended Jimmy Franklin, would allow both men as well as the multi-dimensional ideologies they personified to represent the progressive era's ethos. Now, even now, after decades of insistence and persistence upon a binary interpretation, this archaic dichotomy persists as a damning cost to the Black women contemporaries of these lionized men, in diverting attention from the truly robust Black intellectual tradition of the era, which should have included also Black women like newspaper woman and anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells, an alumna of Shaw College, now Russ College, and feminist Anna Julia Haywood Cooper, an alumna of St. Augustine's Normal School and Collegiate Institute, now St. Aug's University. Even redemptive histories often fall short of redeeming Black women. For his part, Franklin recognized his omission, in addition to calling for increased attention to the Black church, which he hailed, quote, the most powerful social institution within the African-American community. Franklin gave considerable attention to making the case for the role of Black women reformers, whom he deemed, quote, the bedrock of progressivism in the Black community. Among their many eras of progressive contribution were churches, clubs, and neighborhood unions, as well as their undeniable role in the campaign for common schools across the South. His examination redirects credit for common school successes that would otherwise be attributed to white philanthropic organizations like Rosenwald or the Rockefeller Foundations, from them to Blacks in general and to Black women in particular. Black educational institutions that do not fit this model are also unfairly omitted from the era's storytelling, much like the discipline's prevailing histories of Black school change in the United States. Black colleges are not characters, much less champions in histories of the progressive era. Almost a century later, around 100 Black colleges persist as historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, in the 21st century, despite nearly impossible odds. 4 of the state of Tennessee's 6 centers of higher education that bear this federal designation are located here in Nashville. Founded against the backdrop of the city's Athens of the South sobriquet, the region's emergent New South ethos, and Black Nashville's efforts to fashion itself as a burgeoning world within a world. The early histories of Fisk University, Meharry Medical College, Tennessee State University, and American Baptist College are remarkable testaments to interracial cooperation, and even more so, to Black self-determination. Now, most of the histories of freedmen schools turned Black colleges focus almost exclusively on Northern white missionary philanthropy, and likewise attribute most institutional successes to the school's overwhelmingly white founding faculties and staff. Whatever credit remains is without question typically awarded to the Black men in these colleges' leadership. Now, subject to both racism and sexism, Black college women seem to internalize gender norms as well as their occupying or accompanying limits on their roles at these Black colleges. It is astounding then that Black college women, to their tremendous credit, regularly challenge white supremacy while operating within the confines of patriarchy, sexism, and what I dub toxic Black respectability. How they did so is an important and neglected part of the story of Black women, Black colleges, Black progressivism, and Black America. Now, the educational achievements of Black college women are especially impressive when juxtaposed to the reality that the vast majority of Southern women, including white women, received little to no formal education during the slave period. Despite the opening of a significant number of Southern white women's schools between 1830 and 1860, whether reared to be a farmer's wife or a planter's wife, Southern white womanhood was less about a meaningful career or self-directed goals than it was about a girl assuming her future role as wife and mother. Long denied the right of education vis-a-vis laws prohibiting the gathering of the enslaved for education and or religious purposes as a rule, Black men and women had both, since the colonial period, known that liberty was a hollow, empty promise without access to literacy. They, whether enslaved or free by virtue of their Herculean efforts, sometimes created clandestine and makeshift schoolrooms in Southern cities, including Natchez, Mississippi, New Orleans, Louisiana, Savannah, Georgia, and Nashville, Tennessee. This is like a little known fact. It's something that I have published since before my dissertation, and since then, in a few places, that Nashville had a really robust tradition of clandestine or native schools that were owned and operated by Black people during the slave period, beginning in the 1830s. And remarkably, it's not, although it is a great threat to them, white supremacy was and remained a threat to them for their entire existence. It wasn't white supremacy that gave the fatal blow to this tradition alone. It was actually, in some ways, white liberalism and white philanthropy, the opening of these freedmen schools, which at their foundings did not charge tuition, whereas the native schools, Black native schools, did. And so that eroded the student base for the Black native school tradition, and what you had in its stead was the Fisk Free Colored School and others like it that sprang up across the South. In an age where shared survival for Blacks was a remarkable feat, educational efforts by Blacks persisted as a personification of self-determination, racial advancement, and the progressive spirit. The stories of many Black college women could, by this measure, make the case for Black progressivism. This rationale borrows from the centuries-old storytelling efforts of scores of Black women. It centrally positions what Mary Helen Washington in her foreword to "We Are Your Sisters, Black Women in the 19th Century" characterizes as the multiplicity, the particularity, and the heterogeneity of Black women's stories. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to separate the progressive record of Black people in general and Black women in particular from the story that is their life. Intersectionality demands that serious consideration be given to the onerous burdens of race, gender, and class, as well as the inextricable link of them to each other in the life and work of Black women progressives. As a figurative and literal force in the fashioning of the lives of the first generation of Black college women in Nashville, let's explore a little the determination of Virginia Walker, Broughton, Ella Shepard Moore, and Julia Hayden in the most progressive cause of Black women, and that is the cause of education. Now, look, I know you like, why did you have to go through all that? Because you have to make a case, right? It's really difficult when you gotta, you got centuries of setup ahead of you that says, oh, but that's not what we're talking about. But the literal lives of Black women are a testament to their pioneering the progressive spirit, the progressive ethos, and during the progressive era. So who's Virginia Walker Broughton? She's a missionary, she's an educator, she's a feminist who is said to have been one of the first Black women and women, period, in the South to graduate from college. She was born here in Nashville, but she was named after her father's home state of Virginia. She had the great privilege of attending one of those native schools here in Nashville, which was founded by Daniel Watkins. And so she had the extraordinary privilege of being literate and literate beyond measure at the time that she enrolled in Fisk University as a student. In May of 1875, she was one of the first graduates from the Fisk department, from the college department rather, of Fisk University. So she was then awarded a Master of Arts degree. I mean, this girl is like really, progressive, but she does what all women are expected to do. She teaches for a while, and then, sexism bars her, much like it would Anna Julia Cooper. And so she marries this guy, a lawyer. And so it's great, right? It sounds real good. She becomes a missionary. She gets hooked up with Joanna P. Moore, a white American Baptist missionary who enjoyed popularity in Baptist circles. And so Walker Broughton joins Moore's kind of Bible band. And so she's venturing across the South. And as you can imagine, eventually this is going to cause quite a bit of tension in her marriage, which, to which she basically says, like, if you have an issue with my work, you do not have an issue with me. You have an issue with God, who has sent me to do this work. So take it up with God. Largely attributed to women in general and to Black women in particular, the remarkable achievements of Walker Broughton's male, of Walker Broughton rather, drew the ire of her male leader counterparts. Illiterate preachers especially took issue with Walker Broughton's intellectual dexterity and formal liberal arts education, which was matchless, peerless. Evelyn Higginbotham concluded that the strongest opposition to Walker Broughton's efforts and those like them was not whiteness, but ministerial tradition, beliefs, and practices in rural, uneducated communities. Labeled a, quote, mannish woman by her detractors, she also faced, as I said, challenges at home, where her otherwise supportive husband was also an early opponent of her missionary work. Next, Ella Shepard Moore, which might be most familiar to those of you watching. Ella Shepard Moore was an original Fisk Jubilee singer. She was the great grandmother of this woman here, Beth Madison Housewell, who was for 40 years archivist in the Fisk Franklin Library. And actually probably mostly responsible for my interest in Nashville history generally, and Black higher educational history, both in Nashville and across the United States more broadly. But Ella Shepard was actually born into slavery on the Hermitage Plantation. Her father was the half brother of his master. He and his wife, Sarah, had unsuccessful pregnancies. And when Ella was born, they were just over the moon. She was rather sickly and would remain plagued by respiratory challenges throughout the course of her life. But they were really excited to have her. And so you have to understand how heartbreaking it was when Simon had managed to purchase his freedom. And he was under the impression that he would be allowed to purchase the freedom of his wife and then daughter. And somehow Sarah got wind that that was not going to be the case. And she marched the banks of the Cumberland River with Ella at her breast, determined to pursue infanticide and suicide rather than to continue being a slave. She sees an apparition or encounters a woman who no one has since seen, who tells her not to do it. And she marches back and basically makes an arrangement where she barters her service for the freedom of her daughter. And, that's a tremendous gift to Ella. She stays in Nashville with her father, who remarries. Her mother is forced into slavery further south, in fact, in Mississippi, where the owners had moved. And by the time that Ella Shepard arrives as a student at Fisk, in 1868, Fisk is charging tuition. Her father has since died, and so she's taken in ironing and washing and, working her way through school, basically. She's tutoring students. She did have a formal musical training in Cincinnati, where her father had stole away to. He, along with her and the stepmother, in order to prevent them from being taken into slavery as repayments of debts that he could not pay, because he had purchased both his second wife's and Ella's freedom, and by that measure, they were his property, and they could be seized. So she gets to Fisk. Fisk is in bad shape. She doesn't mind, right? Because this is the promise of freedom in the future. And they start singing, and she has tremendous talent because she's been formally trained both vocally and on the piano. She plays the guitar, and the then music teacher, who is also doubling as the treasurer, George L. White, says, hey, you guys should sing, And first they start singing arias and typical, European influenced music. And then he overhears them singing this thing that he'd never heard before, being from the North. And they were what we now know as the spirituals. And that troupe grew into the world-renowned Fisk Jubilee Singers, for which Ella Shepard was an original member. She was also kind of like assistant director. She was an arranger, as George White had no formal musical training and could not arrange music. Kind of like maiden, liaison, all of these things. And she grew very exhausted. But the white male leadership of the school guilted her and said repeatedly to her, like, you know, you can't leave. I mean, this is after years and years and years of endless and grueling tours, first across the United States, the Eastern Seaboard especially, and then across Europe. This is just one example. You know, so when she complained of her duties and lack of recognition, she chided herself in her diaries. Oh, that I could be content to labor on in the field my Lord has honored me with, and not murmur or wish for another sphere to be at rest. Often confiding in her diary that she could not endure her share of the work another day. Her entries indicate feelings of loneliness and, in extreme instances, feelings of despair. During January of 1878, one of her diary entries led, and this is now after 7 years of endless touring, I have a great sorrow, yet I must bear it alone. There are moments when I wish death might come instead, facing the real possibility that it could cause her demise when she accepted then President Erasto Milo Cravath's challenge to lead the troops' final showings. A distraught Shepard wrote, I bade my loved ones farewell. Now, Shepard may have contemplated giving her life in service for the cause of Black education. Unfortunately, Julia Hayden actually did. She was a school teacher, a girl of just 17 years old. She attended a school that most of Nashville no longer remembers, which was Central Tennessee Methodist Episcopal College, which was founded in May of 1866, just 5 months after Fisk University's founding. Right. And so she was described as bright, intelligent, and rather handsome. Julia Hayden was just 17 years old when she ventured to Trousdale County to set up a school for Black children. She had gotten the appointment with the aid of the college's president, John Broughton, and who had come to know her during the 2 years that she was a student at the school. Now, having just graduated, Hayden accepted the call to teach, and with Braden's help, began her very short-lived career in a schoolhouse just outside of Hartsville on July 29th, 1874. And about 3 weeks later, she secured boarding at the home of Hambry Lowe, a Black ferryman who lived on the farm of E.P. Lowe, a wealthy white farmer, trader, and landowner. And basically the story just goes like this. At about 2 o'clock, Saturday, August 21st, just 3 days after Hayden took up residence there, 2 men knocked on the door of Hambry Lowe. The, quote, violent knocking at the door, end quote, was followed by their demand for, quote, that school teacher, end quote. Hearing their demands, Hayden ran towards the Lowe's bedroom, where she attempted to get into the bed alongside Lowe's wife. Presumably for their protection, Lowe stood at the door, barring the entry of the armed men. Quote, we do not want to hurt you, Uncle Hem. We want that teacher, end quote, one of the men said. Undeterred, the men kept banging against the door, all the while threatening to break it down and shoot. Lowe and Fair, for their lives, cried out, Massa Pink, to E.P. Lowe for help, while one of the men ran away saying, we had better get away from here. The remaining man either fired through the door or through the space left open by having forced the door slightly ajar. Just as Hayden reached the Lowe's bedside, the shooter's bullet struck her either in the neck or in the right breast. Hayden shrieked upon being struck by the assailant's bullet, which killed her almost instantly. As blood streamed from Hayden across the sheets of the bed, the gunman made a hasty retreat. So what we find here is this tremendous, and I thought at the time, a story that one could not even imagine, right? And then we had the 21st century killing of Breonna Taylor, and then it didn't seem as special or remarkable at all. These 3 women, as I close because we're out of time, their lives represent the ways in which Black women had to lay their literal life sometimes on all the time on the line, and sometimes lose their literal lives in the progressive cause. Like, while it is valid and real that white women are limited, are trampled upon by patriarchy and by sexism, and sometimes perhaps lose their lives for it. The regularity at which Black women find themselves at the loss of their literal lives in the progressive cause is as unfortunate as it is true. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening.